hope that I will be able to shed at least some light to the questions and issues raised by Raivis, and at the same time not going into too much boring detail, so I'll cherish our time. And first of all, I would like to say that I would rather avoid the word reform, which is a somewhat loaded term. I see it more as an evolution. It's not something ground shaking that we have in mind. But well, first of all, probably why we are actually thinking about reforming or updating the governance model of state museums. It's something that Raivis mentioned, so something that creative museums have been advocating for a couple of years already, and we are grateful for this initiative, and timing seemed right to finally start moving because of a number of issues at play. One of them, the already mentioned state administration reform, which expects all ministries to cut their staff by 6% during 3 years, and state museums are state institutions, so it equally applies also to the cultural sector, so they are, just as all the other sectors, expected to contribute to this reform. And also it's strains in budgeting and a number of issues, so we decided to have a look. So what we did is we asked one of the museum associations in Latvia to do a research piece for us to evaluate what are the possible options, how do we compare with Lithuania and Estonia in terms of museum governance. And I will briefly tell you about what they came up with, and this is not a concrete proposal in motion yet, so this is just a result of the research they did, and they submitted to Ministry of Culture. So the next logical step is then for the Ministry of Culture to move the proposal to the Cabinet of Ministers, so which is something that will happen during this year. So, first of all, I'll really briefly sketch out the possible legal statuses of museums in Latvia. So, the museums, according to the museum law, they are separated by owners. So, museums can be owned by state, by municipality, they can be autonomous, and they can be private. And state museums, which are the main actors we are talking about today, they are by law a public institution or an agency or its structural unit which is established by the Cabinet of Ministers. So more or less it's a government institution like any else institution, like ministries, like National Library in the field of culture, like Heritage Board, which is a status we see as somewhat ill-fitting because by law government institution, government agency is supposed to deal with its mandate, which is in its statutes to issue administrative acts, to provide services to society which are mandated. So like, I don't know, health insurance or insuring your car. So museums are in a somewhat, I would say, straitjacket. So it's a not perfectly fitting form, which puts on quite a lot of limitations of what they can and cannot do. But yeah, Raivis mentioned that there at some point was they were moved, they were changed into agencies, which is a somewhat similar form with a bit more freedom, which then got reduced at some point, and the reason for this was economic crisis, and it was, I think, OECD and the Monetary Fund, which said that there are too many agencies without really getting into any details what these agencies are doing. So agencies as such, as a form of a legal body of a government agency, should be, the government was discouraged to have any agencies. So that's why they became public institutions again. So the same more or less applies to municipal museums. So they are public institutions but established by a municipality. A private museum is kind of self-explanatory, so it's either a non-governmental organization, foundation, or association, or a commercial company or its structural unit. And the interesting form is autonomous museum, which can take two shapes. One is a public institution or agency which is created by so-called derived public person, except municipality. So, for example, a derived public person is a University of Latvia, so a Museum of University of Latvia, or Motor Museum, which is owned by the agency which deals with cars. So they are autonomous museums. Or another form is a state or municipal company or another private legal body which is created by public body, so it's a kind of complicated form, so they don't exist in real life. But this was a form we actually explored first. So this we have a experience in the Ministry of Culture, so that state museums and state performing arts companies, they are state-owned companies, so commercial company, state-owned commercial company. The problem here is that the main aim, as set out in the commercial law, is to earn money. So that's the first and foremost thing for them to do. And obviously, even if Rundale, in their case, they earn more than half of their budget themselves, so they could be considered as a kind of a commercial player, which is also the case with theaters. So they also earn somewhere around 25 to 50% of their budget themselves, but there's still a sizable public investment in them. So we did see this as a potential opportunity, but it was quickly shut down by the Ministry of Legal Matters, and that's not a way to go. So which means that we had to find another opportunity if we want to provide state museums more flexibility, more freedom. So this is a quick rundown, the status quo as we have it now. So there are currently 14 state museums owned by state, and for all of them the legal form is state institutions. So 8 of them are established and governed by the Ministry of Culture, and then there are also a number of museums governed by other ministries, and also 2 really smaller museums which are structural units of one of the agencies under the Ministry of Agriculture. So these are actually the museums the reform will be primarily dealing with. So it doesn't apply really to so much to municipal museums. It certainly doesn't affect private museums or so-called autonomous museums. So it's mainly the target is state-owned, state-operated museums. So I won't go into much detail about what was conclusion about the situation in Lithuania and Estonia. So Estonia will present their experience themselves, but what the research showed that there are actually some pros for the current status. One of them is really stable and predictable environment. So museums actually know how they are supposed to work in this format, they are used to it, and it doesn't seem to have apparent barriers for growth, because most of the museums, most of the state museums are showing increase of number of visitors. We see them developing rather nicely, even if the framework is not really perfect for that. What is maybe slightly interesting for Latvia is the system of ownership of holdings. So the museums, state museums, don't own the holdings, so it's a state property in a sense, and then it's all the holdings of all the accredited museums. They together form a kind of a virtual state museum collection, and the state museums are just dealing with these holdings. And working with them, but not clearly owning them. And The financial administration system, it might be clumsy, it might be tricky, but it's quite clear, and again, people are rather used to it, and they know limitations and are able to work within the system. Then again, as you see, the number of cons actually are more than the pros. One of them I also already mentioned, which is that museums are by no means a typical state institution, so they cannot really be compared with the typical state institutions dealing with administrative functions. So nobody can force anyone to visit a museum, so that's not the duty of somebody. So the people don't have to use the museum, so it's a free choice, it's a public service. Then again, there are a lot of administrative uneasiness and bureaucratical obstacles. One thing which is really silly is that the price lists, which is also ticket prices, they are approved on the level of the Cabinet of Ministers, which can take, if the museum wants to change a ticket price, it has to go through the Cabinet of Ministers, which can take up to half a year, which is just not really normal, I would say, and we don't see this kind of thing in Lithuania and Estonia. Well, it might not be a huge thing, a huge issue, but still it gets in the way. Probably a bigger issue is that they have no budget flexibility at all, which means that as all of the as for all state institutions, their budget kind of resets, turns into a pumpkin by midnight. So you are expected to spend all the budget by the last euro cent by the December 39, which is again silly, which doesn't allow, for example, for museums to create some savings fund for bigger structural investments. That's just not an option. You have to do it in the framework of the yearly budget, which is just not possible really. Then the salary system in the government sector is really strictly regulated, so you have categories and of professions, and you can pay just from to, so they have certain limits and you cannot go above that. Not that any museums are really at this point feeling the pressure that these regulations would be holding back paying more money to its staff, but it's still a system which really doesn't allow a lot of flexibility. Then again, a strange situation, some years ago there was a bigger form of how a state governs its real estate. So most of it's owned actually by state in the person of Ministry of Finance, and it's governed by a separate state agency dealing with real estate, which means that all the museums are actually renting, even if sometimes it's rent without any payment, but they are renting, they are dependable or 100% to this agency, and some museums also rent their buildings from private persons, so and no museum actually owns its building. So involvement in projects sometimes is problematic. So in general, the problems we have with state museums is that it kind of works, but it's not really flexible. It doesn't allow museums a lot of freedom, which we feel that if we would remove those obstacles, that would allow museums for more growth. So the possible solution we saw, and this is something which also was in a more broad context already discussed on a Cabinet of Ministers level some 2 or 3 years ago, that there is such a form as state-owned foundation, but it's not really widely used, so it's mostly the foundations which we have, they do one of 3 functions. So either it's a payment foundation which provides like compensation for health services and this sort of thing, or if it's a foundation which provides funding like State Capital Cultural Foundation. So they are mainly, the foundation is defined as a division of assets. So the way we cut some part of the budget for a specific reason, and there's some entity dealing with this part of the state budget. So this is the reason why we argued some years ago that cultural institutions would benefit if we would use the form of public foundation more widely in the cultural sector, but it didn't meet the political approval, so it's ended dead in the water. So now we are doing it in a slightly different way. So we are not aiming at changing the big law on state governance, but we are doing it through the museum law, providing just basically it's a single line. It's saying that a state or municipal museum, which we realize that it's an important issue also for municipalities after some discussions with museum professionals here in Latvia, that it can take also, besides the forms, legal forms already in play, also a form of a public foundation. So the whole reform basically boils down to one sentence. And the caveats are that, first of all, we do not really plan that this will be mandatory. We feel that we should take some time, so we really intend to start with Rundal Museum as a first pilot project to see how it actually works in practice. First of all, of course, we have to still get this through the cabinet of ministers, so you never know what happens, so what the other ministries think of this, because it's kind of a heresy in terms of speaking about how the government agencies work. It's we're kind of trying to smuggle in something almost heretic. Then the way we see it working, if it actually passes, and we will see how it works with Rundale. So it's a fine detail. How do we provide the budget? So we see we have this experience with state-owned companies like theaters. So we have fixed-term funding agreements, which are typically for 3 years, and then each year we renegotiate the actual yearly budget. So it's a somewhat different system than now. But it provides us an opportunity, which we are really quite excited about, is that we will see that it will provide more room for the ministry to negotiate more with the museums what actually ministry is expecting of them. So it's somewhat different. We don't have currently really this culture of clear KPIs and agreements what the museums are supposed to do. There is of course the big cultural policy. There are museums strategy, so which paint the big picture, and all the museums are expected to chip in with their work to meet the targets. But I don't think we have really worked sufficiently enough so far with clearly negotiating the expected work and impact of each state museum so far. So I see it as an opportunity to have more communication, which is somewhat different. I just talked about this yesterday with my colleagues from the Ministry of Culture of Finland. They said that they kind of felt that if the museum is a foundation, then they lose the connection, they lose you could say control of what the museum are doing. So the negotiation, the communication is actually harder for the ministry. So we, at this point, we hope that this will, in our case, will be exactly the opposite, that it will provide a new platform for dialogue. Then the important part is what will actually happen with the holdings of museums, and we don't see a significant change here. So we still, the state will still be the owner of holdings, and the foundation in any way will be user of these holdings. And all the acquisitions they do, they will just then also belong to the state. So yeah, pilot project Rundal Museum, that's also mentioned. And two options I know that creative museums have been really insisting upon for a long time. One is terminated contracts for directors, and one is museum boards. We do not necessarily see it as an integral part of this reform, but we see that it could be a good thing to do. So we intend also to move forward with those two provisions in museum law. One is to establish that the directors are chosen for 5-year term, without the cap of how many times you can actually use this 5-year term, because we understand for a small country it's kind of tricky. So for a career growth, it's probably not be a very stimulating thing. So you have just 2 terms and then it's over, and then you are at loss what you do, which is a kind of tricky thing if you are a director of a big national museum. So what is your career opportunity after those 2 terms? But I think it's a good thing to really reevaluate the work of the museum and the director every 5 years, and then to see the temperature whether the museum would benefit from the change of leadership. And the other part is the boards. There are 2 options, which there were some discussions with museums here, whether it should be really operational boards who are in a sense owners of the museum, like it's in Estonia, or it should be consultative boards. And we are leaning towards the form of board as a consultative body for the director, but not necessarily the board as a mechanism to run the museum. So we actually saw more cons than pros for those boards as owners. More we see the boards as a help and support for museums. So, and to move to the benefits, what benefits do we see after this reform? Is first and foremost, it's more independence and more flexibility for museums, especially in financial terms. For example, as I mentioned, if Rundal needs to change its roof, which is a big investment, currently there is just no really simple way to do that, so we have to negotiate with states. Real estate agency, whether they have funds, and then it's a gradual repayment through budgets for a number of years, so it's a complex thing. This model, I see that as museums, if they are no longer state institutions, they can accumulate funds, so they doesn't cease to exist by the end of the year, so they can actually accumulate funds. They could potentially take loans, they could potentially enter partnerships with other partners for bigger structural investments if they are needed. So there are more action, more possibility to more flexibility in financial dealing. Then obviously less bureaucracy. One example which I mentioned is approval of the ticket price by the cabinet of ministers, so that's gone. Then also more flexibility towards salaries, so salaries are not anymore tied to the state salary system. It would be possible also for those foundations to own the real estate, which is especially important for 3 museums where the real estate, where the building actually is a part of the museum, which is Rundal, Tervete, and Turaida, and then Free Air Museum, whatever it's called in Latin. Sorry?
Open Air Museum.
Open Air. So that's thank you. So where the buildings are actually part of the exhibition. So that's obviously to be negotiated with the Ministry of Finance, whether they also see it as a heresy and sort of an unwelcome exception to the general rule how the real estate is governed in Latvia, or they welcome it. So let's see. It's down to the discussion with them. Then. Clear communication of expected results is something I already mentioned, but what I find really interesting is it would open a possibility to create joint foundations. So another political reform which is currently taking place is administrative reform. So currently we have 100 something municipalities, so they are expected to merge together and then form somewhere between 30 and 40 municipalities. So we see that municipalities will become more serious players. We expect that they will also contribute more to the development of cultural sector. And so in some cases we could see that both municipalities could form sort of a consortia of museums in a region under the umbrella of a foundation, or some museums could be transformed as a joint state and municipal foundation, as is the case also in Estonia for some museums. So it also allows more flexibility on the ownership models. And after all, well, there should be some higher goal as well. So it's not just flexibility and just independence and more freedom, which is always nice, but it's not the end game, the end result. We see that the implicit goal here with this evolution or reform, whatever you call it, is that museums will be stimulated to grow the quality of their services, to grow the sense of the ownership of the museum, and then really that's as an end result will also be that the society, the public has better quality of service from museums. So that's how we see it developing in the future. So that's more or less it for me. Do we do questions now or later?
Right. Yes. And we say thank you. Yes. I think we are on the same page. The benefits clearly outweigh the possible problems that museums might encounter in doing this transition. But and I don't wish really to go back to those scholastical questions. Either it is a reform or it is just amendments to it. Though I showed you the long history of Baltic museum tradition in a clear sense of the term, it is a revolution. You return back to where we started. But my question is, and I think question of those who are here from the state museum, so let's get back to numbers. Those 6%, are we solving the problem of a cut of a 6% if we go through the pilot and turn at least one institution into a foundation, as we call them?
Well, first of all, it's not the main motivation.
Of course
Definitely not.
But the motivation is that you're not losing your head of collections or your communication staff.
Yes, that's what we expect. That's what current analysis show, that the employees of these public foundations will be no longer considered as employed by government, so they are not government sector.
But do we solve the problem if we turn one of the state museums into foundation?
That's something we still have to discuss with the state chancellery, of course. So what their opinion is. So if they would say, sorry guys, it's cheating, then we'll have to find another way. But
we have to
find cut the National Library, and Heritage Board, and Ministry itself.
I don't know what we are cutting, but we are museum advocacy group here. Okay, yep. So if we even disagree on some issues, who should be cut, we should stay friends. This is friends room code. But anyway, guys, this is a moment when we need a clear answers how we solve this problem. We're going to solve this problem. If not, then I understand by 2020, late 2020. We are facing a huge problem for museums, because already a couple of % cut means for some of those institutions a huge blow.
Yeah, I get it. Well, first of all, we never really intended that. I think that's something that was done during the crisis. So it was kind of a shared responsibility. So all institutions are expected to cut the same, percentage of people. So we don't approach it this way. We see really the cultural sector as a whole. So that's the way the state chancellery is actually seeing us. So they see cultural sector, which includes also probably not high schools, but professional schools and all the sectors.
So you would go after somebody, not necessarily museums.
Yeah. We actually, what we did start already during last year is first we looked at the ministry itself, where we can cut the staff in the ministry. So that was one of the reasons why we actually merged the units for libraries, archives, and museums. So we lose one person.
Did we lose as a sector one person? Merging those?
Yeah. So we lose we used to have the head of the museums unit and head of the libraries and archives,
and we lost.
So it's one.
Nice.
So that's the way we approach. So we really wouldn't want to cut, the living flesh, which is museums.
That's the point. It's procrastination.
So
that's what you do with
yourself.
yourself.
The last thing we would do.
Yeah, my question was, can we solve this the smart way so that we are not losing anything? We're just turning an institution into a foundation. So all the staff, 100 people. How many are there, Laura?
140.
40 people. Just change their legal status. They are not under the previous law anymore.
Yeah, but as I said, it might be considered cheating. So you never know.
And
what was interesting, by the way, what was interesting was revelation for me in this research piece I mentioned is that actually Latvia has the lowest number of museum workers per 1,000 inhabitants. So apparently we have
in Europe or in
Baltic states compared to Estonia and Latvia. So
Right.
Estonia had something like 170
Yes.
museum workers per 100,000 inhabitants. Lithuania was somewhere 120, 130, I think,
Okay.
and Latvia was 111, 110.
Yeah.
So, which means that already the situation is, in terms of employment, means that the human resource in museums are strained
Scarce.
to the border of
This is
impossible.
This is absolutely right, because we're getting signals from all the sectors, of all the areas of our sector: collections, communications, education. Everyone is short of staff in larger state-run museums. Right. I don't wish to take all the time. If anyone wishes to ask anything to Uldis, please do now. If not, we move on. And by the way, if you're a bit shy of asking directly, write a small note and pass it to me, and I'll ask later on. Okay.
I have a question about the boards that decide, you know, where the museums are going. In the U.S., for example, and also in Europe, it is interesting how the boards are, who is invited in, whose opinion we value as a society or that museum. Do you have any guidelines about that, and or will they have influence also of the development of museum?
Well, probably our Estonian colleagues would be able to tell more, but what we get from the research is that it's pretty much down to the museum directors themselves. So they are, well, the ministry is approving the board, of course, but as I understand, but the museum director is more or less handpicking the board. So I think they are expected to have, I don't know, maybe it's not for all the museums, so you will be able to tell more, but as far as I'm concerned, so the boards are expected to have one representative from Ministry of Culture and one representative from Ministry of Finance, which kind of makes sense. And then the three other guys, they are, probably depends also on the museum, specifics of the museum. It makes sense probably to have some legal expert, for example, or collections or research expert. But I mean, we do have already, I think, models in some museums like Tervete, which have those called support foundations, which are NGOs by the form, but which raise money and also act as advocates for museums. So there you actually already have the model. So these are normally persons with some public weight and some which have enough voice and enough weight for public to really to shape the opinion.
But it would be hard to kind of control or to have this vision of diversity of the board. You already have two people that have to be in, and the three people that are kind of, you know, collections and so on. So I'm just thinking about the civil society, or NGOs, who gets also saying on these boards, or who influences decisions, because it could be the director just picks his friends and very like-minded people, and a museum in a way stays the same. You know, it kind
that's certainly a possibility. That's a risk.
Right. Issue of regulation, really. How you put it down?
That's a good question, whether we want to regulate it or not. So first of all, probably we need a discussion in the museum sector itself. So what the current experience is, what the feelings are, and what the best practice could be. So
But
I see it's more of a self-regulating thing.
Okay. Since Lolita raised this issue of boards, my question, I didn't meant to ask, but still, is it that the boards and foundations is the most cheap model to run that you choose in the end? Because a year ago, 12 months ago, we were sitting in a similar situation as a foundation. This is how museums function in Europe, elsewhere, further afield, and everyone said no. The state secretary says no, this is impossible. But then you calculate it, and you look that you would pay those board members perhaps 100 euros because it's mostly a voluntary and a civic engagement that they do something good for their society through working on a board. It's not It's unlike in a harbor or in a railway or elsewhere that you get those thousands of euros and every second week we have a scandal in the news. It's a completely different story here. It's grassroots, right? And it's cheap.
I don't think we have ever framed the discussion in terms of money or what we
No, but
pay for the
there
board.
would be expenses for, but it will be not a huge expenses. It would be a rather,
It depends.
a rather gesture.
As Estonian model shows that if it's a board which is running
Yes.
the museum, then obviously you have to pay them something. But then I think what we saw the biggest weakness is how to actually ensure that the board is engaged and it's competent and it's professional. If they're meeting like 3-4 times a year and just rubber stamping everything that the director showed, then it's kind of defeats the purpose.
So it must be a motivation
Yeah,
in those people,
that's
and that's very different as it is in Americas, where they pay for being on board and they pay hundreds of thousands of dollars,
really
and that's where the influence starts.
So, and we don't see that these 100-200 euros per month would really motivate those
Right.
people. Probably.
So, but it is, you
That's
agree
why
that
we
it is
are leaning
most
more towards
efficient model how to run.
That's why we are leaning more towards consultative boards,
Right.
which are not necessarily paid board.
Good.
But anyway, the reason why we said strictly no a year ago was mainly not because the model itself didn't make sense, but we just didn't saw any legal opportunity.
Right,
So
and now you see
leeway. So that's
since
why
the
we have experts.
Ministry of Finance said
And
no
the
to
report-
capital foundations,
And the
you
report
turned to-
was essentially it was done. The legal part of it was done by the former State Secretary of Ministry of Culture, who is a lawyer
Yes.
himself and been working in the cultural sector for a long time. So that was why we needed him and
Sure,
provided the legal leeway.
Okay, we're closing this. I think once again, Uldis, and we go ahead right with our first pilot project that we in this country.